Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for Best Practices in Sharing Data with Elected Officials. I'm Josie Schaefer, the Director of the Center for Public Affairs Research, but I am so excited to introduce Renee Fry as our presenter. Renee is a native of Madison, Wisconsin. She has a BA and a JD from the University of Nebraska-Lincoln. Her BA is from Wisconsin-Madison. She has more than 20 years of experience working with the Nebraska legislature as a staffer and then as the Executive Director of Open Sky Policy Institute. Current role.
That's old, Josie.
Too much. And I just really adore Renee Fry. I was so glad that you were able to join us. Renee is actually on the advisory board for this whole series, and honestly just helped us to reframe so many great things in so many different ways. So thank you, Renee. Thanks for being here.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for having me. I want to clarify, I'm no longer the Executive Director of Open Sky Policy Institute. I stepped down. I started at the Logier Foundation at the beginning of August. So in a different capacity now. We don't have too many folks. So I want to really keep this conversational. Please interject with questions. I also want to warn you, I have never done this presentation before. So this is a new one for me. So bear with me. Hopefully it won't be too disjointed, and that at least you'll get some helpful tips, maybe, hopefully. But please just feel free to raise your hand. Josie, will you be able to keep track of the chat if anyone has anything?
I can absolutely do that. And yes, everybody, please use the chat for questions. Or yeah, we are small enough. If you use a reaction or something, we'll see you.
Yeah, just raise your hand, do whatever. Again, you don't need to wait until the end to ask questions. Please ask as we go. I really want to try to keep it conversational. All right. Let's see. There we go. Okay, this is a slide. You'll see it in the bottom left. If it says UNO, Center for Public Affairs Research, I have taken the slide from Dr. Schaefer for a presentation that she actually did to help me out last fall. So one thing I just want to start when you're working with elected officials or when you're doing any sort of work with data, it's really important to differentiate between your facts and your opinions. And I think, as someone who led an organization that was really grounded in data analysis, it was really important for us to stick to data. And you want to make sure that when you're stating a fact, you're stating a fact and you're not implying that your opinions are fact. I think that's really, really, really important for credibility of you and your organization. If you start to talk about your opinion as fact, you are going to lose credibility with your with elected officials. So you just really need to be clear when something is a fact or when it's an opinion. So I just want to make sure that I'm stating that up front. All right, so again, slides from Dr. Schaefer. And Josie, please, if you have something to add, please do so. I would love to tag team with you. So where data can help, I think it's really important when you're defining a problem, you want it grounded in data. If you are advocating before the legislature and there is a problem you are trying to solve for, I think most folks assume that it is a data-based, something that is fact that you can prove. And data, you can use data to document the existence of this problem. I also have, Josie, I can't remember if you showed some of the resources. Well, I'll get there. I'm going to show some of the resources that you have at UNO that I didn't see you use this morning. But you can also quantify the extent and demonstrate the correlates of a problem. So I'm going to go back and forth, toggle between a couple slides to show this. And you saw the slide this morning from Dr. Schaefer. But here this morning, she was really able to use data and use this chart to define the problem, right? So you can see using data that 9% of Nebraskans have less than a high school graduate, right? And that their salary, their income is less than someone who has more education, right? So here she's really using data to define the problem. And I think that this is a really, really great graph and visual that she's put together, because it has all of the elements that you want. It has a really strong title, very clearly states the conclusion, and also you can clearly see the trends here, that the more education someone has, the more income that they make. And so I think that this is a really, really great visual, and using that to illustrate the problem. And again, it also quantifies the extent and demonstrates the correlates, right? So you do see here that correlation between educational attainment and income. So this really checks all of those boxes. You can also use data to identify the solution. For a lot of you might be looking at different interventions, and those are data-based. A lot of academic research maybe is what you're pointing to, that show which interventions have more success, which ones work and which ones don't. You can also identify unintended consequences of a decision. When I was at Open Sky, we spent a lot of time talking about unintended consequences, and I'm going to show you a slide that illustrates this. So I know this is really, really busy, but what I want to illustrate, and not ideal for, this isn't something that you would want to just give to an elected official without any sort of explanation, but we used what we call our real Nebraska taxpayers to illustrate the impact on real, so these are actual real taxpayers in Nebraska, and we use them to illustrate what sort of an impact a bill would have on each taxpayer. So here, what I would point out is that we have our folks based on income. The amount of income they make is at the bottom. And what we found in this particular bill, and why I wanted to highlight this, was unintended consequences. So this was meant to be a bill that would cut taxes for folks. And when we did the analysis, what we discovered was that some taxpayers would have actually had a tax increase. So here we were able to use data and actually ran the impact on real Nebraska taxpayers when you looked at the impact of their income tax change and combined that with the impact of the property tax change and had a net total tax change. So here you can see that Ken and Kim are real taxpayers that have AGI of, or adjusted gross income of about $35,000, would have seen a tax increase of $162. So I just wanted to use this to illustrate how you can use data to show those unintended consequences. And we used these real taxpayers quite a bit. I have a different slide that's a little less busy than this one. I will tell you the reason that we broke it up, though, was so policymakers could see the impact of these tax changes in isolation, rather than just giving them one final number. So again, as you're talking about solutions, one thing we would try to do at Open Sky is not just give them, here's what happens, but also, and here are some solutions that would mitigate the issues that you're dealing with, or those unintended consequences.
Just
So
1 second.
Yeah.
That really goes with the point I made about narrative complexity too, right? We don't know all taxpayers in a bracket, but we know Fritz, right? Like, it is really helpful to kind of make a connection too. So it's pretty impactful on a couple different levels.
Yeah, thank you. We heard from policymakers. Senator Friesen would ask us regularly, I want to see the impact on your real taxpayers. They're really helpful, right? Because and then I'm going to show you, we also would look at tax changes and on an impact by quintile as well, but really being able to identify real people at different income levels and what the impact would be to them really made it much more real life. So they really knew the impact of the policy change they were discussing. And then also prescribing how the intervention works. Data can help in political processes. That's what we're talking about right now, right? And can really help, again, a lawmaker see the impact of a policy change that they're discussing, and help them make really informed decisions. And that's why I think data is really, really important. It's important that it be accurate, right? And that it's not opinion, but that it's fact. And then you can present that to policymakers to make a decision as to whether that's a policy that they want to see enacted or one that they don't. But you can use it in all sorts of other areas, stakeholder analysis, raising the quality of debate. Hopefully with data, policymakers and others are able to have a higher quality of debate when you actually have that data that illustrates the impact of a particular policy. You could also use it for strategic planning. So in terms of defining the problem, visualization, again, this is Dr. Schaefer's slide. So you want to keep it simple. Dr. Schaefer talked about that this morning. You want to accurately represent. This is really, really important that your data be accurate. At Open Sky, we double, triple checked our work. We would have other folks check someone's work just to make sure it was accurate, because again, policymakers are making decisions based upon your data. So you want to make sure that it is accurate and that you are representing it accurately. And I've got a couple slides that can illustrate that as well. You want to make sure that you customize it. You want to label it, but not too much. Include your source information. And then I think it's really important that your title include your conclusion. So again, if we go back to that slide of Dr. Schaefer's, here she has a really, really clear conclusion in her title. So we know when we're looking at this chart, there is no confusion as to what our takeaway is. We can see that right in the title.
Jumping in real quick too on that one. So I actually showed it a little different this morning. I've changed up the title, and it's there's nothing wrong with this one, but over time I've kind of played with it. I've tested it. Like I've seen how people react to it. I've talked about it, so I know what people focus on. So now it says education pays, and then I talk about the difference. So I think too, right? Like it's a great lesson. Like there's not one way to do it. You do have to spend some time. And there's nothing wrong with this one. It's just kind of morphed as I've added new data and been in a different context with it.
Right. And I think that's a really good point. And something that you can also, as you're talking with policymakers, and when you have the opportunity to sit down with the policymaker and you're sharing data with them or sharing this chart with them, sometimes you get feedback that does make you think about how you're wording that title, or you get feedback from someone else that looks at it. So you want to really be flexible and get that input so that you are, again, you want to make sure you're accurately representing what it is that you're showing. But also if it's not very clear to someone else, it may be very clear to you, but it's not clear to someone else, you can get that input and make adjustments. All right. So here was another slide, and I saw, again, this was one, Dr. Schaefer, I think you showed it a little bit differently this morning. But again, I think it's a really good example where you have your takeaway that's in your title, right? And then it's really clearly showing, not only you have two different markers, right? You have the income marker where you can see that an Asian male makes $45,000 compared to a white male who makes $50,000. But then you also see that she has that 90%. So you can see that an Asian male makes 90% of what a white male makes, right? And so I think she does a really nice job here of showing it a couple of different ways, because income in and of itself, that first measure, may not say as much as being able, no one's, and when we think about her presentation this morning and what people can remember, right? Someone's not going to walk away from this and go, oh, a white male makes $50,711. That's a number that's not going to stick with people. And an Asian male makes $45,702, right? But someone can take away an Asian male makes 90% of what a white male makes. And so for a policymaker, that is something that they can grab onto, right? Something that they can remember, that they can use in debate. It's sticky. Again, when you're thinking about what people have the capacity to remember, or that a Latina female makes 54% of what a white male makes, that is sticky. But it's also really important. I think those income numbers sort of validate, right? So policymakers, again, you want to show them enough information so that they know that you've done the work and you're not just giving them numbers, but it's those percentages that are going to be a little bit more sticky. But anyway, I think that this is also a really useful way to look at data because of that stickiness and because it's so clear. The point that she's making with the slide is so clear. Did you have something to add?
Sticky is such a good point. Does anyone want to guess, or does anyone want to scold me on my language choice here and why I've fixed this slide over time? Renee probably wants to scold me. Non-whites. The group of people that I'm talking about is people of color, right? Non-white centers on who I am, not on the group of people I'm actually talking about. So it's fairly biased language. I actually did use non-whites a lot back in the day because it tends to be easier, right? It's white and then everyone else, but you're talking about the group you're not talking about, right? And that has some issues. And but if you're talking about people of color, you should say people of color. In this, now I say compared to white males, all other gender, racial, and ethnic identity intersections. It also has the problem of I'm showing both race and ethnicity. Latino is not a race, it's an ethnicity, but people kind of think of it that way. They tend to lump it. So I want to show it because it's actually really interesting with Latinas making 54% of white males. But I don't like my language here. It says the takeaway. It's very similar to the graph. I've just updated the data. I've also put in median income for all as a reference line now. But more than anything, I just didn't, it was biased language, and I'm learning to. I think actually when I presented, your group called me out. I didn't include Native Americans in this one, and I've also added that now. Your group called me out on that, so I fixed it. Thank you.
Do you know what that percentage is? I'm curious.
Okay, so Native male is 71% of white male, and Native American female is 57% of white male. Yeah, so above Latina, but not much.
Yeah. Okay, thank you, and thank you for pointing that out. All right. So I know how Dr. Schaefer feels about this chart. But I also think it's a really good example of what not to do, which is the context in which she shared it. As I indicated, she did a presentation for us last fall and used this as an example of what not to do. Because when you look at this slide, it looks like we're saying that 44% of Nebraska, the Nebraska population is foreign born, which we all know is absolutely not true. But I think what this slide is really about, Dr. Schaefer, correct me if I'm wrong, but 44% of the growth in Nebraska's population is foreign born. So, which is very, very different. Which again, so the data isn't wrong, right? But it's not being represented in any way that seems accurate. So it's the way that it's being represented is misleading. So it's not the data that's a problem, but the how it's being left to be interpreted as a problem. Anything you want to say?
Yeah, talk about sticky numbers. I will say that a state senator called one day and told me, it was during the redistricting. We weren't very involved, but we were tangentially involved because of our role with the Census Bureau. And so we had released some numbers. This wasn't at that time, but a swear to God, real state senator called me and said, well, all the growth is from, I believe the term was illegals. I didn't say it. all the growth in Douglas County was from illegals. It's 44% illegals. I was like, dude, where are you getting that number? I didn't say that actually, but that's what I was thinking. And he was like, it's from you all. It's from the Center for Public Affairs Research. I have this slide right in front of me. I said, would you send that over? Because I'm at a loss where we would have ever said that. And here's the slide. And I know the context in which it was presented, the slide right before says that the overall growth rate is like 5% at the time. And so we're only talking about half of 5%. It's a very small number. But right, he didn't look at the slide before, he looked at this slide. And so when you think about sticky numbers, right, or things sort of on their own, right, I really worry about this, right? Like you put out a whole set of numbers, but without context and explanation, and you right there explaining, well, this is of that, it gets misinterpreted a lot. And I actually, in this particular case, the state senator was not wrong. That's what the number said, and it did come from us, our name's on it. So it's hard. But these are those kind of things where you really got to play and experiment with stuff and see what people take away. And I think that sticky numbers concept is really important because there are numbers that are easy for people to remember. So that's what they remember. That's what they see. And to be honest, it's big and it's red. I would see that too here. When we talked about this morning, I showed a slide too, where something just sticks out. So that's what they remember. It's not at all what we were actually trying to say here. And it's just a bad chart type for this data.
Great, thank you.
Yeah.
All right, so we've covered some of this, but I just want to reiterate, for policymakers, you really want to focus on impact. You want to keep it simple. You want to provide some key numbers and only use a few statistics. So when we started at Open Sky and I would go testify and I would read all of these numbers and senators' heads would explode. And but you feel like, okay, this data is really, really important. I want them to have all of it. But I could tell that I was just losing senators because there were too many numbers. So we had to try to figure out, okay, how do we still present the data without being overwhelming? And I'm not sure if we have it down to a science, but we really started paring those numbers back real significantly so that I'd really only focused on what's the most important number, what's the thing I want to leave them with. And then if there was some other data that we found that we thought was really important for them to have, but just didn't want to include that in testimony because it was too many numbers, too overwhelming, I would include that as a handout for senators and say that I'd be able, I'd be happy to answer questions about it and try to include, make sure that the numbers I was handing out were clear. But you got to be careful of that. And even I would say as we went using fewer numbers and even using less handouts because it just really could be a distraction. And so I think where we've sort of landed is if it's that important for other numbers, then it's probably worth a one-on-one conversation with the policymaker because in a hearing, for example, it's just going to be overwhelming. So pick your statistics, what's most important. Again, running something by a colleague or by a senator that you have a relationship with to see, what stands out, what's most important to them, or what you think, again, what's the thing you want to leave them with? If they remember nothing else, what do you want to leave them with? And they're not, as Dr. Schaefer illustrated this morning, people aren't going to remember that many things. So be selective. You want to make sure the data is real world. So for example, 1 in 4 children, again, is going to be easier, or almost 1 in 4 children, rather than, 23%. Which is or 23.96. We used to do that as well. We would have these ridiculously specific and exact numbers, which we thought was important. But again, isn't sticky, is hard for those numbers for folks to hear. But 1 in 4 is really, again, an easy way for a policymaker to absorb that data. You can provide aggregate data, like how much of X was saved. use visuals or infographics in your written materials. I think that really helps. I'm going to show an example of, well, Dr. Schaefer showed it this morning, but I'm going to show it again of an example that I think is really well done. Tell stories that have impact. You want to weave that impactful data into your story, and especially if you can talk about the impact to their district. And this is where, Josie, have you shared these before? Otherwise, I'm going to go here. She's got some really great, I'm going to try to go here.
I'm bad at, I like tell people they exist, but I rarely go there with people. So thank
yes, you these are fantastic. So I'm going to show you these two. And can you see, just want to make sure.
Will you stop share and then bring it up on the website?
Okay, you can't see the website. Okay.
Sometimes it works, sometimes it's not.
Oh, we're gonna have some barking. Sorry. Okay, so can you see it now?
All good.
Okay. So so Josie's got these fantastic numbers on their website, and I assume slides will go out, so you'll be able to have the links to these. But she has these quick facts by legislative district and by county as well. So if there's specific data that you're looking for, this is really great because they already have it broken down by legislative district. So, and this was something I just found out last fall. It's like, I can't believe I didn't know about this amazing resource. So, so do use their information. They've got just all of this great information. Again, this is by legislative district and by county. So I highly recommend, if you're looking for data, to start here. They also have, so you can also see how it compares, how districts compare to each other, which I think is really, really cool, and something that we do sometimes at Open Sky. And so let's see, what else do you have here? So there's all of these. So you could look at unemployment, for example. And you can see here how the different districts compare to each other and compare to Nebraska and to the United States. So this is just, again, I think a really, really cool, useful tool for folks to utilize. And you don't have to do this all from scratch or go to the, census.gov to find it yourself. So let's see. Okay, let me pull up the other one. Maybe I lost you guys. Oh boy. All right. Sorry.
No problem.
Rosie, say something smart while I'm looking for this.
I will not. I want to know, like, great stories of you hanging out with state senators and struggling to communicate data to them. I feel like you have some good ones, no?
Say that again?
I want to hear some great stories of you trying to communicate data and it being difficult.
Here,
When you have
okay. All right, I can't find the other one. Keep trying to bring it up.
Does anybody have particular topics or projects they're working on in communicating to elected officials they want to share or get feedback on? Complain about? This is hard work. We have to complain too. Sorry.
All right, thanks for
I tried.
Yes. So here is their slide on counties, essential data for Nebraska counties. So again, demographic data. So maybe, for example, if you're working with a local elected official rather than the state legislature, you want to present data to Douglas County, for example, like the county board or something, you have the specific Douglas County data you can pull here. here, the population, mobility, something else that that I didn't know was on here. SNAP. I was playing around with this yesterday and I saw that there is a SNAP information. So I really encourage folks to spend some time on their website. It's really useful information there. All right, now we're going to go back to the presentation. Maybe. All right.
So about those dashboards, we created them because people would call us asking for data. It's all Census Bureau, American Community Survey, some Bureau of Labor, but things that like people would ask us for, we were like, well, we should just make that available through us for Nebraska, right? But it's all data you can get yourself, but we've just sort of picked the ones we think people use the most or want the most, and tried to put them in an easier to get to format than going through some other processes. And like you too can have your own dashboard just by calling us and asking and being like, oh, that's a good one. And if it's really something people ask about all the time, then we want to update that and share out too.
Great. Thank you. All right. So I just wanted to show an example. So here's one, an example, something pretty standard that we used at Open Sky that I think is really easy to see the numbers, right? So here we have quintiles. So this is one way to see the impact of proposed policy on taxpayers. And again, here you can see by quintile, we have the income that they make, so the range in income, so you can see that in the amount of the tax increase or the tax cut. So again, thinking about unintended consequences, and here, so you're raising taxes on 80% of Nebraskans and cutting taxes for just those top 20%. So anyway, I think that this is a pretty easy visual in order to see what the impact of that bill would be. Another way to look at it, I showed you our real taxpayers earlier. Here's another way, using those. Again, we can see here that most of our folks in Nebraska are taxpayers that aren't millionaires, get a modest, if or nothing, tax cut in this case, whereas our millionaire gets a really significant tax cut. And so again, there are different ways to show data. And again, we had a lot of success using our real taxpayers. It's just a different way that's more versus seeing it by quintile, and here really pulling out what a constituent would actually, how they would be impacted. So when you're talking with lawmakers about data, you want to keep it simple and specific. Again, really thinking about, you're immersed in this data, right? You think about it, you run the numbers day in and day out. Policymakers are not experts in most areas. So you have to be really, really mindful of that. While it's something you spend a lot of time thinking about, they have to deal with, 1,000 different topics and areas and pieces of legislation, and they're having information that is just coming at them constantly. So you want to be really, really simple and specific. Avoid jargon. I did that earlier when I can't remember what I said, but I used, AGI. Make sure that you're saying, adjusted gross income. Make sure that who you're talking to, if you're going to use adjusted gross income, that the person knows what that means, or you might want to say it a different way. So be really mindful of not using those acronyms, not using jargon that a policymaker is not going to be familiar with. Don't stretch the truth. Just, again, this is going to go back to your credibility. Same sort of issue as opinion versus fact. If you are asked a question, if you don't know the answer, tell them you don't know the answer, but don't try to make it up. It's not a good idea. Just don't stretch the truth. Tell them you'll get back to them. And make sure that you're sticking to facts. Respect the limited time that they have. And so you want to make sure that you're concise and to the point. Another reason why you don't want to throw a whole bunch of data at them, you want to really just focus in on what's most important, because they just don't have a lot of time, and they're talking to lots of other people. One thing I recommend is developing an elevator speech with the 2 to 3 points you want to convey. And so much like if you've done much in the way of if you've ever done a media interview and you want to jot down what your main 2 to 3 points are, and then you just want to stick to those, I recommend doing that with policymakers as well. So you have, the data point, and what are what are those 2 to 3 points that you want to convey to make your argument. And again, just stick to those and practice it so that you are really concise. I suggest also practicing that with a friend who can give you input as to whether they are hearing what you are trying to convey. But again, they have limited time, limited capacity. So develop that speech and practice it. Also, you want to, when you're working with policymakers, you want to tailor your story to that audience. So what is important to Senator Kurt Friesen is going to be different than what's important to Senator Megan Hunt. And so be really cognizant of that. And this is where if you have data that's specific to their district, that's ideal. Or if you have a constituent that you're working with that's in their district, and also think about what they care about, and also you want to be respectful of their values. So if you go into a meeting and know that they feel strongly about a certain thing, you don't want to come in and tell them that they're wrong, right? Because that is their value, that's their belief. You can show them data. You just want to make sure that you're very respectful of that in the way that you're talking about the data that you're presenting. So make sure that you've done your homework and know who you're talking to and what they care about. So that you don't use data and come at them where you're coming and telling them that basically they're wrong, or that their values aren't accurate or something like that, because we all have our own values and opinions, and we need to make sure that we're respecting other people's values. Create an emotional connection if appropriate. Again, a story that highlights the problem that you're talking about can be really, really impactful, particularly if it's in their district. Keep in mind political and economic realities, right? If you're presenting, data and you're pitching, let's say you're pitching a piece of legislation that costs a lot of money and the state doesn't have any money, you might want to rethink your approach. And then make sure that your information that you're presenting is timely. You don't want to come at them with something that, that they don't have to deal with for months and months and months, because they're operating in the here and now and don't have too much of a runway because they have so many other things that they're dealing with. So just keep that in mind as well. Josie, you have anything you want to add?
I have a question for you on this.
Sure.
So this is a Census Bureau problem. They're a good year behind us, always, and for a while there. And some particular sources, like the economic census, is every 5 years, or the specific census is every 10 years. And I know from doing research, social things don't change that much. It's probably pretty close to what it was in 2017. Don't get worked up. But I have a lot of people come to me and say, no, we can't present that data. We need the most recent data. That's the most recent data, and it's 2020, and enjoy, right? You can use 2021, but it's probably wrong, so don't use it, the 1-year estimate. But I know, and then hyper-local information too. I feel like a lot of senators want the most recent information and hyper-local. And especially in a state like Nebraska that's really, really rural, there's not a lot of hyper-local data. I mean, you guys use a lot of those data sources too. How do you deal with something like that? Because that's something I get a lot of pushback about. And even when people are working with us, we can't use that. Yes, you can. It's great data.
Yeah.
Yeah. How do you talk about it?
Yeah, that's a good question. I probably should have included some other resources that we typically would use aside from census data. We use a lot of data from Legislative Fiscal Office and from the Department of Revenue, for example, a lot of state resources. And so I think to your point, usually the data is pretty consistent from year to year. So, so if you can show that or illustrate that or use a 5-year average, I think at least tends to help mitigate some of those concerns. And I do think, at least for lawmakers, there's a recognition that there's a data lag. So I don't think and you don't want to be using something that's, 5 or 10 years old, right? And again, I think that the way that we really mitigate that is by looking at a 5 or 10 year average, or maybe even longer. Sometimes we would do that around, how much do you need in a cash reserve, for example, right? Like then we would want to look at trends and not limit it to just the most recent year. You do want to look at trends. So again, it sort of depends on what you're using it for, but I think using multi-year data or even, a 10 or 20 year average can help mitigate because at least you know that you're not cherry picking, right? Oh, that's the other thing, actually. Something that you want to be really mindful of, and I think it's helpful to look at to avoid people accusing you of cherry picking data. Do take a look at, for example, if you go 5 years, you want to look at a trend, and the 5-year data looks very different than the 10-year data. You want to make sure that, or your start year is so what we saw coming out of the Great Recession, for example, right? There was really big increase in revenue, and during the Great Recession, really big decrease. And so by including the years of a Great Recession as a starting point could really impact your numbers significantly, because it was such a low starting point for revenue, and then it would make it look like our revenue growth was significantly higher. So we really tried to avoid, looking for those outlier years and avoiding using those as a starting year or an ending year that would make your data was correct, right? But the story you were telling with that data was a little bit misleading. So again, I think if the data is consistent from year to year using a 5-year average, but I think works in that case. Using the information that the state has, I think, is another way to really help with some of those when your data is lagging a little bit. And that's the best I can come up with.
Yeah, I think it's just good to say to people, it's okay. You don't need last month's data all the time. You don't need, very super specific locations, right? With geographies especially, I'm like, you do not need that by census tract. No one cares, right? They know their county. That's data, right? It's helpful, but people want fine-grained data, but I don't think, especially when you're presenting to a group like state senators, they think in big chunks more so than these small little places. So I think both of those are important. Cherry picking is another one. And I'll say there's sometimes a trade-off with data viz. I forget what I was making the other day, but it was a graph where they started at the same point. So I went back in time to get to a place where they didn't start at the same point. But that wasn't an analytical thought. It just made the picture better. But right, you've got to watch that. I could have really misinterpreted the data if I just did it because it looked better, right? But also it did look better. So why would I show it that way, right? Coming up with some reasons. I've had that one. So never stretch the truth is a good one. And I don't think people go in intending to lie, but I think a lot of times, right, we want to be smart. We want to work out the problem. We want to be oh, wait, I know this or I know that. I think it takes, I think, because I don't have any, it takes like a lot of presence and thought. And like you were saying, preparation to go in and like stay on message. I mean, you've talked about that, but like, do you have any tricks for sort of keeping it together and those sort of high stress, high important conversations?
Yeah, I mean, I would just reiterate, you write your points down and just keep coming back to them, and practice them ahead of time. Sometimes at Open Sky, we would do, if someone was testifying that didn't have a lot of experience testifying, or certainly like the first few times that I testified, we would do sort of a practice, mock hearing, just to get those questions out. And that was actually really helpful to do that, because folks would think of questions and, oh gosh, that's a really great question. I don't know the answer to that, so I should figure out what that is, so that if I'm asked that in the hearing, I know what the answer is. Or in the meeting or whatever. So I think practicing and having other people help you practice is a really great way to prepare. You're just more confident, and then you're less likely to say something that's not accurate either, right? If you've prepared and practiced it, you're less likely to inadvertently stretch the truth or to use a number that's wrong. But again, if you don't know the answer, it's perfectly acceptable to say, it's a great question, I don't know, and I'll get back to you. And I do that all the time in talking with policymakers, because I'd rather tell them I don't know and get back to them than to give them data that's inaccurate. All right. So things to avoid, we covered some of this. Don't present background information that's already known. Again, lawmakers don't have a lot of time, so you don't want to spend a lot of time giving them background. Sometimes when I talk to policymakers, I might ask them, do you have the history? Do you know this? Do I need to give you some context or background? And if they're really well versed in the area, then you just can skip it and get right to it. So you want to, again, meet them where they're at and not spend a lot of time telling them something that they already know. You want to avoid poor presentation skills. Again, practice. Don't stray from the topic at hand. Again, if you tell a senator you're there for a particular purpose, you don't need to start wading into some other area. Again, they have limited time, so just stick to the topic at hand. Again, try to avoid offering too many details unless the senator request that. So for example, Senator DeBoer loves having lots of data, lots of numbers, but for most senators, they don't, you don't want to give them too many details. You want to just stick with the one or two that will stick with them. You don't want to take more time than needed. Again, they're really busy. Don't use too many complicated graphs and figures. And again, we talked about confusing fact with opinion. So Josie, do you have anything on this slide while my dog kicked my my charger off? So I need to like duck and plug it in. I'm so sorry.
Yeah, so I was using too many complicated graphs and figures, right? Like it's a real attack on my job, but it's really something I actually didn't do a ton of before I came here. And then everyone kind of liked the pictures. So we really have invested in data viz. I also have awesome partners in Terra in investing in data viz. But I told this story this morning, right? Where people tend to like think we're entertainment. I've never thought of data presentations as entertainment. So good for Nebraskans that they're so into it. But there's a couple things about the complicated graphs and figures that really pull people away from the messaging, right? Now they're focused on this or that looks cool, or whoa, I've never seen it like that. I hear that a lot. Oh, I haven't seen it like that. But I don't want you to be impressed that I made a figure. I want you to take my data away and do something with it. So it's kind of something I went whole force in, but I'm like, how do I pull back? How do I do a little bit more writing? How do I not put something on the screen that you stop paying attention to me because you got to look at this so hard? And then two, I'm working with our chancellor a bit, and she does not like a graph or figure. She's a PhD in business, I think in finance specifically, but she does not like a figure. She likes words. She likes a sticky data point. She'll really hold on to a sticky data point, but she doesn't need that image. So for me, I'm really now trying to go back in and say, well, wait, how do I make this point just in words? How do I put an image that captures your attention but isn't the focus? And I think I honestly probably screwed up in the past by being a little bit too focused on the data viz at the sake of the message. So it's something I'm grappling with currently. I do think our state senators are extremely smart, but limited attention really means limited time to look at that picture. So just tell me what I need to know. Data viz is great, but it's not that great in all of these settings where we share information. I've said this too for like the nonprofit folks. A lot of grants, you can't show a picture. You just get to say the sticky data point. So kind of working back and forth between the two has been something I've had to get a little bit better at. But I think a lot of people want to make pretty pictures, but I think sometimes we're wasting our time, right? Like we just have to say it. Yeah, I'm dealing with it right now. I'll come to you for help.
It's an evolution for all of us. I just wanted to mention the one pager. This is something that's a really useful tool in working with policymakers. It's basically your elevator speech on a sheet of paper, and I'm going to show a couple of examples. Again, you want to start with a strong title with your that's supposed to say your ask and the main benefit. You want to lay out your case using up to 3 main points: problem, impact, ask. And you want to flesh out those bullet points. But again, you don't want a whole bunch. You want to make sure you're not using too many words or it's too dense. And again, I'll show you sort of an example of what to do and what not to do. You want to summarize as a solution and finish with your call to action. So things to think about: be positive, use white space, be a ruthless editor, do a better job than I did in editing this slide, use graphics wisely, include your company name, logo, and contact information. Unless you're working with a senator on a regular basis and you're texting on a regular, you have that sort of relationship that you text with them regularly, and make sure you include your contact information, because when that bill comes up, then they can look and see, that's the person I need to reach out to, rather than making them do the work and try to remember, oh God, who gave this? I mean, I cannot tell you how many times someone gave me this. A senator someone gave me this. I don't remember who gave this to me, but someone gave me this. So help that senator out by putting your organization's name and your info on there as well, so that they remember, they know who gave that to them if they want to follow up with something. Also, PDF, if you're sharing it electronically, would be my recommendation, so that it doesn't get distorted in any way. So I pulled a couple of examples. I thought, I have no idea who these people are. I just was searching images online for some examples, but I thought this was like a really great one pager. Schools, not jails. It's time to invest in education, not incarceration. They have these facts, and they use these data points, right, to make their argument. So I thought that this was a really great example of a one pager that's really easy to digest, has a few data points to support their argument. So I thought I would share that as like a good example. And it says, it's this campaign. Well, maybe they didn't say who did it. They have some handles here. So that would be the one thing I would suggest, is make sure it's clear who did the one pager. But other than that, I think it's a pretty good visual. Okay, so I'm hoping to get a little interaction here. Do people think that this is, what do they like about this or don't like about this? Get people to take themselves off mute and chime in.
Okay, if it's bad, I'll live.
Anyone? No one?
It seems like it's text heavy. Kind of small.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. Any other thoughts? So I actually like this as a visual because I think for a few reasons, especially in working with elected officials, senators always want to know how we compare to other states, like always. And I love that Dr. Schaefer here has the surrounding states and has this check mark to show how other states do bonding. So, you know, Eva, I totally get what you're saying. I also like, you know, and maybe there would be a way to make it a little bit more visually so it wasn't so text heavy at the top. But I think that I really like the map. What's that?
I mean, the bill name is long. It's not our part. No, it is, and it's like packed kind of at the top, and then it kind of.
Yeah. So maybe you include all that information on there, but just reorder it a little bit. But I really, really, really love this map here a lot because a senator just really walks away knowing how we compare to other states, which they love. They always want to know that. And there's a description of what these two different types of systems are. So I think as a one pager, I actually like it. I mean, I think in any one pager, if we could probably pick it apart and find things about it that we would change, which is also the other reason to share it with other people, get people's input before you go to print, because someone else, you know, you show it to Eva and Eva's like, oh, I think it's a little text heavy, right? And so in her opinion is really valid. And so you go, okay, all right, so how could I change that a little bit? So that's where I highly recommend sharing it with other people, especially if you can share it with someone who's not immersed in the issue like you are, where you can get that feedback from someone who's not living it day in and day out about what would be helpful to them. But I really love this map here, and because I think it's really useful. I also really love this box. Nationally, Nebraska is one of only 5 states that do not use either bond type for transportation purposes. Again, like that is a sticky data point, right? Like that is sticky. And so I love how she kind of called that out in red. So
I will just say about that figure 1, and also this is not a one pager. I am notoriously, I tell Tara, it's going to be 1 page front and back, and then it's like 8 pages. I'm like, sorry. Which is, again, why I need to keep working at this. Data viz that isn't data viz, right? Just an image, like that's not fancy data visualization. That's a map, and then we put some check marks over it. Right. And I think that's where people need to kind of think about it. Does it need to be a complicated graph? Did I need a whole table of everybody's and what they have? Nah, I could just make a picture that does a lot of work for me without being complicated. That's what I like about that one too.
Yeah. So, okay, again, here's a map. Looking at a county map, you know, again, I think that this is, Josie has in that title, again, Nebraska's population has increased, but 69 counties have lost population. And by using these colors, a senator can clearly identify their legislative district by looking at this map. They know exactly where their district is, right? And they can see what's happening. So from a visual standpoint, I really like, I like the use of data this way. If you think about it, if you had just a, you know, a chart, right, with all of the counties, it would be really ugly and hard to find. They'd have to look alphabetically, right? But having it on this map is really cool, easy to find, to see exactly what's happening in their legislative district. So I think using shading like this, the different gradients and colors is really a great visual way to show data. All right. I know you showed this earlier. I don't know if anyone has an opinion.
It's word heavy. I'm sorry.
Yeah. So there's a lot of information on here, a lot of really great information, but it is really, really word heavy. And so I think it becomes a little bit harder to figure out what the takeaway is. Again, and I'm not trying to, open sky, we do this kind of stuff all the time and are trying to be a little bit pickier about the information we put out. Again, like a Senator DeBoer would love this level of detail. But not all senators do. So you want to, again, try to think about what it is that you want them to take away and try to focus on that with a little bit, maybe fewer data points. We've got a lot of, at the top, we have a lot of income ranges. We got a lot of numbers, and
I like how I put it in bullet points, like that somehow made it all shorter. Just bullet point every word, and then it's all bullet points. It can't be long. Yeah. Well, it's funny. I kind of use it as a good example of an argument, but I totally agree. It's not a good example of a one-pager. I actually thought about it when I was talking about it this morning, for that same reason. And I would say, right, like these are things I've learned. I don't need every data range and the exact number. I can just say, oh, over 150,000 or something, whatever. Right. That's fine. And yeah, that's a lot of, this was pretty early on where I was doing, like I thought everybody needed every piece of data. They don't need that. Why would they need that? Let's be clear, he didn't ask for that either, right? Like that's me projecting onto it much more than it was what the senator asked for. And it is also not one page.
Right. Yeah. And again, I mean, we love this data. We think it's all important, right? And so we think everyone else wants all of the data. And there may be a couple of elected officials that do want all of the data, but most of them just want, what are the one or two main points. And so, again, if you have all the data and you have a senator, wants all of the data, you can provide this to them. But for everyone else, you really want to simplify it and get right down to the, what are the key takeaways?
Just a reminder, we're going to end in 5 minutes. So y'all ask some questions while you have a chance.
Oh, yeah. And we can do that. I've got a couple more examples, but I'd rather do questions.
Anybody want to get anything in? We have a kind group today. Keep going, but just so you know, 5 minutes. So get in questions while you can.
Yeah, so I'll just show this, and this one isn't particularly pretty, but I think it's pretty, the takeaway is pretty clear. It doesn't require, for something that's really, really complicated, it doesn't require a tremendous amount of explanation. So someone can look at this chart and you don't have to walk them through it, which, again, I think is really important. If you've got something complicated, you want to think about, okay, how can I give them the information in a way that they could, they can see what's happening without you having to explain every little thing. Because if you do, people aren't going to use it. Here was one that I found and I thought my head would explode. This is way too much information. Don't ever do this. I mean,
I
look
like
at
that
all
it's
of
an arts organization too.
Yeah.
And
it's bolding numbers does help. You can bold something so that you can see it better, but there's so much bolding on here that it sort of eliminates its usefulness, right? If you're going to bold everything on your page, you kind of missed the point, right? Way too much information on here. So I saw this and I was like, oh man, that is a great example of what not to do. And again, I think all of us look at it and we're just like, whoa, you can tell. So I'm not sure who thought that this was a great idea to put all of this information, to squeeze in everything everything that they could. But again, that's where having having a friend that you can show it to where they go, whoa, that's way too much.
Look up at the top too. It's
helpful.
as of 4/2/2021, right? We can tell you all the books on data viz in the world to read. We're all still going to break the rules here, recently, right? This isn't like from 1984.
Right.
This is what we're going for sometimes.
Right.
Yeah. I will say sometimes you got to go over to trim down, right? I think a lot of people will just do a little bit and then they're like, oh, it's not enough. No, sometimes you got to go there. It's easier to do a lot and then say, well, this doesn't help, this doesn't help, this doesn't help, than it is to add. So if that's your sort of MO, go ahead, just add it. A lot in that case.
Yeah.
This is good.
Just one more example. This is something that, again, Open Sky puts out in their legislative district demographics. There's a whole lot of data on here, like a lot of data, but I also think it's really pretty. I think Tiffany did a nice job making it visually appealing enough that you can figure out what it is showing you without needing someone to walk you through it. So again, the idea was just giving it's sort of the information that Dr. Schaefer has on the UNO website, and then putting that into kind of a visual. It's just a takeaway for senators, so that they have an idea of what the demographics of their district look like. So even though there's a lot going on here, I think when you look at each section, again, you don't need someone to walk you through it. So it's a nice way to present a lot of data in a way that's visually appealing. So I thought Tiffany did a nice job with that.
It does look good. I think too, is it kind of like a gift to them? Is it like an opening conversation? Here's some data you get, because then we want to tell you something. And how do you think senators think about data sort of broadly, right? Like a senator
think about what?
Think about data broadly, right? Like, do they think of it as a commodity? Is it like something they really want? Is it kind of frustrating because sometimes it makes them rethink things? What's their vibe when you come in data heavy on them?
So I have 27 seconds to ask that. I think it depends on the senator. But I would say for the most part, having district specific data is really, really helpful for them. It is a really good tool and can make a difference. I think, in an argument when they're talking about a specific bill. So again, I think it sort of depends, but
I warned myself that we were going to get snapped back here quick, and then we were in the middle of a great conversation. Thank you all for joining us for the breakout sessions. Thank you to our breakout leaders and moderators. I know we had a blast. I hope others did as well. I want to remind you, following your attendance, to take the evaluation. Matt just put it in the chat for you. We are really eager to do more of these, but we are wanting to know what you want, how we can best respond, what kind of programs we can offer that are meaningful to you. So please complete that. We are also, if you finish at the end, you can put in your email and we're going to offer you discounted registration in the future. So please get those in. I want to remind you to stay in touch throughout the year. This is part 2, so we don't have anything planned currently, but hopefully we'll be back in touch soon. But you always check our website. We're putting all sorts of new information and data out there all the time, and you can always email us to stay in touch for all of your data needs. Thank you so much, and I hope to see you all soon, maybe even in person.